too. I was working in the U.S. Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. We had a hearing in 2006 where we had a scientist named David Deming come speak. He was a geologist, and he had just had some climate work published in the journal Nature back in the mid 1990s. And he was approached by a UN-affiliated scientist who said, after he had his big study published in the, I believe it was Journal Nature, that, quote, we have to get rid of the medieval warm period. This is what another UN scientist said to a climate scientist who was publishing in a journal. And the question is, why did they have to get rid of that? Remember, the first UN report showed the medieval warm period much warmer than current temperatures. The hockey stick took the medieval warm period, flattened out little ice age, and then rate current temperatures up here, like the blade of a hockey stick. Yeah. So we had, his name was David Deming, and he detailed how this happened. And then lo and behold, they did get rid of the medieval warm period, and they came up with this hockey stick. Why was it so important to get rid of that medieval warm period, especially from the first UN report?
Yeah. So if you're trying to convince people that something scary is going on, if they're going to look back at medieval times and see that it was as warm, if not warmer then they're not going to be frightened. So that's why they had to get rid of the medieval warm period. And I included the story about David Deming in the book because it's a great little anecdote. So yeah, that's why they did it. And you can see by the way that they tried to protect the hockey stick in the years afterwards that this became really important to them. I think not just because they had managed to remove the medieval warm period and make things look much worse than perhaps they really were, but also because of all the bad things that they'd done to protect it. They had to then keep that going and keep trying to protect it. And yeah, so the thing went on for years and years and years until eventually the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, just pushed the paleoclimate studies into the background a little bit, and they don't rely on it anymore. So they've now moved on to other things like this myth, fairy story, if you like, that extreme weather is getting worse. Yeah, that is where the fear is coming from now. And they just really don't like to talk about the medieval warm period or the Roman warming period or the Minoan warm period. They don't like to talk about any of these things. It's just the myth of the climate emergency today is what it's all about.
Yeah, well, here's the part that you may not know is in the U.S., the Biden administration, the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, has a heat wave index going back to 1930s. And in this U.S. database, it's the continental U.S., it shows the heat wave index. The EPA chart shows it looks like the medieval warm period, 8 to 10 times hotter than any heat waves since the 1930s, including today's heat waves in the U.S. So this data, the EPA came out, Biden EPA came out with a chart that said heat waves getting worse in the U.S. My first thought is, how is that possible? They started the date in 1960, which is one of the cooler periods of the 20th century, all the way up to the late 70s with cooling. And they said, look at the heat waves, and they changed the scale. Had they gone back to the 1930s, they would have shown a precipitous drop in the heat waves. Well, here's the part you may not know. A scientist named Andrew Dessler from the University of Texas A&M announced on his Twitter feed that essentially it's time to get rid of the 1930s heat waves in the United States for the exact same reason that they had to get rid of the medieval warm period, because it was inconvenient to sell unprecedented heat waves here in the US when the own data from the Biden administration's EPA shows a much higher. Does it surprise you that this kind of stuff is still going on today, that if a scientist sees data that counters the narrative, their first goal is to literally get rid of it, in quotes?
No, it doesn't surprise me at all. This has been going on for so long that almost nothing they can do will surprise me any longer. But I mean, they are going to have to do a lot of work if they are going to try to keep this narrative of fear going. I don't know whether you're aware of there's quite a well-known table in the IPCC report itself, table 12.12, which lists all the meteorological phenomena and whether they've been able to detect a trend in any of them. And for pretty much all of them, with only one or two exceptions, they can't find a trend at all. So anybody who looks at that, the official science, will not be frightened. They'll go, okay, heat waves are getting a little bit worse, and cold waves, well, we're having fewer of those, but that's good, isn't it? So yeah, they really, I think the wheels are starting to come off the narrative of fear. Now, I think nobody's frightened anymore, are they? I mean, we've heard about the climate emergency for so long, but anybody who looks around them goes, well, it's just weather, isn't it? It's much the same as it's always been.
Yeah, in fact, at the US here, we have a new poll from Monmouth University, just came out a few days ago. Support for climate action has softened due to a drop in the sense of urgency on the issue, particularly among young adults. So it looks like the Greta Thunberg movement is failing young adults, and it's like a 10% drop just in the last year. What do you attribute a rise of that? I don't know if there's something similar is happening in Europe, but to me, it's because people are losing faith. Part of the reason is people are losing faith in these institutions, scaremongering. And a lot of that to me comes from after COVID. Before COVID, people could appeal to NASA, the UK Met Office as authorities, and you can't challenge it. They say climate's a crisis. Why can't you? You're not a scientist, and blah, blah, blah. After the public health debacle of COVID and lockdowns and mask mandates and vaccines and all the fear mongering, people are more willing to accept the fact that big government related institutions are willing to juice the studies in order for politics. And I think that's contributed to a rise in skepticism. How is that view in Europe? Does that sound like that's plausible in Europe too?
Absolutely right. Yeah, this is definitely happening here too. I mean, as soon as the questions about COVID and the vaccine started to appear, my instant thought was this will play in our favor on the climate front because people will stop trusting the scientists. And as the evidence of vaccine damages comes on, and people start walking away from all the things they'd said about the vaccines before, that is going to keep playing into our hands. There is another aspect to this as well, though. We've been saying for a number of years that climate catastrophism is essentially a secular religion. And you used the word faith about it, faith in scientists, but there is also faith in climate catastrophism as a religion, and people believe it instinctively without thinking consciously about it. It's just, there's fear there. I need to do something about the fear. We've always said that the thing that was going to deal with that was going to break that faith in the climate religion was going to be economic pain. And in Europe now, the economic pain is hitting really quite hard. You have things quite easy over there in the States. You've fracked for gas. Fossil fuel prices are low there. We refuse to do it. We closed down our shale gas industry before it could get off the ground. We closed down coal bed methane. We're in the process of closing down the North Sea. And then we've had the Ukraine war with energy prices going through the ceiling. And all of a sudden, people everywhere, right across Europe, are feeling the economic pain. And they're starting to ask themselves, I think, questions about why this is happening. And I think they are putting two and two together and thinking this climate catastrophism stuff, the net zero stuff, is actually something we need to actually look a bit harder at, think about rationally, rather than just taking it on faith, if you like.
Yeah, I was amazed. The UK fires report, I believe that was 2019. It was partially government funded. This was the report that said we need to treat carbon dioxide similar to asbestos. So what humans exhale, they wanted to have like radical reductions in flight, radical reductions in meat eating. It was just really a truly bonkers report. I read, I think it was forgive my ignorance. It was I think it was the House of Lords transcript about the debate about this UK fires net zero report. And what struck me is it seemed like even the conservative members of the UK government officials all accepted the premise of a climate crisis and the premise that net zero was necessary. And people just pushed back on some of the extremes, but not any of the actual narrative or premise. Is that still the case in the UK today, or in Europe, throughout Europe? Are the politicians just neutered from ever even challenging the claim of a climate crisis, and or the net zero as a perceived solution? Or, are there a few politicians, or is it generally, because even your prime minister, Rishi Sunak, seems very weak on the issue overall, although he seems to be getting better.
Yeah, that's pretty much right. The overwhelming majority of politicians in every party are right behind the climate crisis idea, the climate crisis fairy tale, you might say. They're right behind the idea of net zero, and they don't want to question it. There is a small-ish group within the Conservative Party called the Net Zero Scrutiny Group, which is much more skeptical. And they do try to ask questions, but they're a small caucus, and they really can't make a lot of difference. And the thing is, in our parliamentary system, if you want to get on, you need to stay the right side of the prime minister. The prime minister, Rishi Sunak, is trying to hold together this rather fragile coalition within his own party. The party has brought in a lot of what you might call wet liberals, who are not conservatives by any stretch of the imagination, and they are very green, very behind net zero, and they threaten to cause trouble if there is even a hint that the government might go weak on the issue. So we've had warm words from the prime minister. We've had warm words from the energy secretary saying that people need to be told the truth about the cost of net zero. They've told us that we need to know it, and they're right. We do need to know it, but they will not tell us. They have not told us. We are now 6 months on from Rishi Sunak saying that, and he has done nothing about it in the interim. And the reason is, of course, that if people knew the true cost of net zero, we wouldn't be doing it, because it would be obvious that the net zero medicine was worse than the alleged climate change damage. They are just going to try and string this out until the election, and then who knows what happens after that. Labour, we're going to get an election pretty much by the end of the year, and the Labour Party, of course, are even worse. There is almost nobody within the Labour Party who asks any questions on this issue at all. So things are likely to get quite bad in the UK in the next few years. I think the Labour Party will then immediately run into issues with the costs, though. Within the first couple of the years, they will discover that there isn't any money to spend on all these big net zero promises that they and the Conservative Party are making. And then there will be a crisis, and who knows what happens then. Maybe sanity will return, but I'm not holding my breath.
All right, Andrew, there is a historian named Saul Friedlander who described 20th century totalitarian regimes as essentially enforcing magical beliefs through the bureaucracy. Does that apply to this whole net zero agenda? The idea that are these not magical beliefs that they're going to transform energy, transportation, food supply, and make this all like targets and some Soviet style plan, and energy, everything's going to be cheaper and everyone's going to be prosperous and happy? How in the hell is this going to end? This is madness. What's happening in Europe, and what's now US, of course, is following along, depending on our election cycle, of course. But where does this end, and where does this magical thinking end? How is it going to end? Because they can't actually do what they're talking about, because I don't think Europeans would even accept a moment of it.
No, I think that we don't have the money to do the things that they say we need to do. And in many cases, we don't have the technologies to do the things they say we need to do. For example, there is still this black hole, if you like, over what we're going to do when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. I mean, the UK is supposed to run essentially largely off offshore wind farms. When the wind doesn't blow, what are we going to do? And they bandy around this word energy storage, but they don't tell you what the technology is, because as soon as they name a technology, you can point out to them that it's far too expensive. So batteries are just preposterously expensive. We're talking trillions of pounds, and the batteries need to be replaced every 10 years. People talk about hydrogen, but the technologies for if you want an engine to turn hydrogen back into back into electricity. Well, they haven't really been invented yet, at least they haven't been deployed yet. So yeah, it is completely magical thinking. We have no cost benefit analysis. Now, I mean, to me, this is just the killer. This is what tells you that what they're doing is essentially irrational. They're saying we are going to do net zero no matter what, no matter the cost. We're not going to think about the cost. So they haven't prepared a cost benefit analysis. The government has a set of official advisors on net zero called the Climate Change Committee, who are extremely dodgy, shall we say, that you wouldn't trust them any further than you could throw them. And yet we managed to get their calculations of what the cost would be. They only looked at the costs, not the benefits. And we got them under FOI after, a year of battling through the courts. And the numbers are completely fictional. I mean, it was extraordinary. So one of the things that had jumped out at me when they published their report was that people were going to save money by shifting from internal combustion engine cars to electric cars. They were going to save money. How does that work? I mean, why wasn't it happening spontaneously? Okay, so when we actually got hold of the calculations, the reason they came up with this was that they were assuming that an electric car was not much more than half the price of an internal combustion engine car. And what is more, they were assuming that applied today at the time the report appeared. Now, you and I know that if you go to a motor dealership, it's the other way round. The electric car is much more expensive than the old-fashioned one. So this wasn't an accident. You can't accidentally do that.
Yeah.
I'll tell you another story because I like these stories, and it took me a lot of work to get the answers. So if the wind doesn't blow, right, you need a lot of storage. Okay, and they were assuming that the storage was going to be hydrogen. The longer periods you get with no wind, the more hydrogen storage you need and the more expensive it gets. So they managed to get the cost down by assuming there basically wouldn't be any windless days in 2050. I mean, just absolutely extraordinary. I mean, people should be fired for this. They absolutely should, but they get away with it because the whole of the political and media establishment are just putting their hands in the air and saying, well, this is what we want to do. We're going to do it anyway. They don't care. And it's absolutely shameful. And, eventually the wheels will come off this. And then, fingers will start to be pointed at the people who said these things. But, I guess they all hope to be retired by then.
Yeah. Well, this is the intentional rationing of energy, food, transportation, freedom of movement. You have, as you mentioned, the billionaire class, the political class, the academic class, corporate media, the ruling class. Everyone is just all in on this, right? To hell. They just want to make it happen and everything will work out. We'll invent some technology that'll make it all happen. Don't worry. They're creating chaos intentionally. And all they're really doing is outsourcing European energy to China, which is going to have higher emissions per unit of energy. It's insane. So do the farmers' protests and the temporary halting of the Green New Deal, the elections coming up. How does this end? We have about, I think we only have you have about a minute left. How do you see this ending? I mean, you say, these people, it'd be too expensive, but ultimately, is there going to be like riots and protests in the street and net zero is going to just die a quiet death? Or is it are they just going to keep pushing and pushing until you have societal collapse of energy, food, transportation?
Okay, my bet on this is that because we're British and we don't really do protests quite as well as people like the French, it'll probably be like this. What will happen? The Conservatives will go into the next election and will get wiped out. Labour will get into power and it will be a mess because they will have spent all the money's been spent, and so they can't spend all the money they need. They will then fall apart. And I think what may happen is that the Conservative Party in opposition will reform themselves and go, okay, now we need to start being serious about this and take a look at what we can do differently. And at that point, I think we will turn away from net zero. Probably not in the headlines, but in practice. We'll say we're still doing it, but we're just going to take a bit longer about it. And then it'll be kicked into the long grass and we'll carry on.